Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. This week I want to use this introductory part of my program to say a few words about the outgoing president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin. The president of Israel is elected by the Knesset. The term of office is 7 years. His 7 years ended this week. He's being replaced by Isaac Herzog. I live less than a 10-minute walk from the residence of the president, so I've become accustomed to the often noisy cavalcades of important visitors coming to meet with the president. During the last 7 years, Rivlin has earned the respect of Israelis, Jews in the diaspora, and foreigners, and he leaves office as a beloved leader at the center of the national consensus. During his term, he lost his wife. He tackled a slew of national setbacks, including 4 costly elections in 2 years and the pandemic. He was born in Jerusalem 80 years ago to a family of strong community activists who had been living in Israel since 1809, and he never forgot his roots. A plaque has been put up in the garden of the house of the president, and his very, very nice sculpture, very realistic sculpture has been placed there. He'll be remembered for his ability to draw the country together. He boosted the partnership between all the Israelis. He served as a leader for all and will be remembered as a worthy president through 7 extremely turbulent years. On his last foreign trip before leaving office, he visited Joe Biden, the U.S. president, and received with respect due to the president of Israel. He'll probably now do other things in public life. I'll talk about other things on the program, but I wanted to make sure to mention Reuven Rivlin. I'll be back after the break.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. I want to say a few words about a subject which simply will not go away. It's a subject that has been around for at least 2,000 years. The subject I am referring to is anti-Semitism. Up until the middle of the 19th century, there was a thing called Jew hatred. But in the middle of the 19th century, a German writer by the name of Barr coined a new term. We called it anti-Semitism. So that's the new name, the modern name for Jew hatred. Now, right now, there are a lot of countries around the world and a lot of people, including members of the American Congress, who are openly anti-Semitic. They don't take into account, or they're not interested in taking into account, the fact that Israel, different than any other country, faces existential threats, and Israel acts in self-defense. It acts to protect his citizens, not to attack anybody else. In the meantime, Israel is subject to petitions by teachers' unions, faculties, student senate, student bodies, members of Congress, and other groups. Israel is being attacked. So we should stop pretending that these hateful, one-sided petitions are anything but anti-Semitic. History will judge the bigots who create these things. So should all decent people today. Let there be no doubt that the recent spate of one-sided petitions singling out Israel for condemnation are motivated by hatred of Israel precisely because Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people. The bigots who promote these petitions and the useful idiots who sign them cannot possibly be motivated by a concern for universal human rights. If they were, they would focus on nations with really horrendous human rights records, and I can give you some examples. Iran hangs gays, China imprisons Muslim descendants, Russia murders dissenters, Saudi Arabia discriminates against women, Syria, which uses gas against its own people, as well as Palestinians and many other nations that face no external threat such as Israel does. Israel faces existential threats to its very existence, and acts in self-defense. Israel does not act offensively. Israel acts defensively. It does more to protect innocent civilians than any other country faced with comparable threats. However, Israel is the only country that's subject to petitions by teachers' unions, faculty senate, student bodies, and other groups that seem to focus more on Israel than their own mission to improve the lives of their own members. There's a vast difference in tone, in content, in nastiness, and in bigotry between legitimate criticism and the demonization that these petitions direct against the nation-state of the Jewish people. Thomas Friedman, who is a very frequent critic of Israel, said, and I quote, "Criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is vile, but singling out Israel for opprobrium and international sanction out of all proportion to any other party in the Middle East is anti-Semitic, and not saying that it's anti-Semitic is dishonest." The United States provides a lot of funding for Israel, but it provides funding to Jordan, Egypt, and now it is providing funding to the Palestinian Authority. President Trump cut off the funding to the Palestinian Authority, and the Biden administration has brought it back again. However, you have to take into account, perhaps differently than any other country, and certainly different than the Palestinian Authority, Israel gives back as much as it gets to American national security. If the United States were to suddenly cut off all aid to Israel, the petitions would not stop, the hatred would not abate, and the bigotry would not end. Surely the justification has nothing to do with the comparative records of these various countries, nor is this based on support for the Palestinians. The same petition writers and signers who write and sign against Israel have been notably silent about 4,000 Palestinians who were recently killed in Syria. Nor were they heard from when Jordan killed thousands of Palestinians. I remember back in 1970, it killed many thousands of Palestinians, or when recently Hamas murdered members of the Palestinian Authority during its coup in the Gaza Strip. So all this discrimination is not about the Palestinians. It is simply about the Jews, and it is about hatred toward the Jews and the Jewish state. Some of the critics, by the way, are Jews, and one could argue that Jews have a special obligation to be critical of their own state, but that would not justify the bigotry shown by so many non-Jews, both in the United States and in Europe. By the way, it's interesting. I want to quote what a Palestinian human rights activist by the name of Bassem Eid wrote about the Squad. The Squad is that group of Democratic politicians in the House of Representatives in the United States who were very critical of Israel. This Palestinian human rights activist wrote the following: I'm a Palestinian who grew up in the UNRWA refugee camp outside of Jerusalem. Let me say this as directly as I can. Representative Omar does not know what she's talking about. For years, worse, Representative Omar in the House of Representatives has been engaged in not arguing any facts, but simply throwing out dirty anti-Semitic epithets, a mirror image of the anti-Semitism by white supremacists that she claims to decry. Politicians like Omar Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the U.S. House of Representatives spent a considerable amount of time attacking Israel for the supposed harm Israel inflicts on Palestinians. If they truly cared about the well-being of the Palestinians, they ought to focus their attention elsewhere. There is the reason that many of the Palestinians suffer is because the direct result of corruption of the Palestinian Authority and the influence of a terrorist group, Hamas. Unquote. Everything I quoted now was by Bassem Eid, a Palestinian human rights activist. So you have it right there. So we have to stop pretending that these hateful, one-sided, and mendacious petitions are anything of what they really are. Anti-Semitic bigotry, pure and simple. Hopefully, history will judge the bigots behind them harshly. However, all decent people today should also judge them. What they are saying is not based on fact, it's based on their anti-Semitic feelings. That's the bottom line. Unfortunately, there are people now in the House of Representatives who suffer from this anti-Semitism. I don't think anything could be done to change them. That's the way they are. I don't know. I don't know what the history of dealing with anti-Semitism has to do with changing anti-Semites into pro-Semites. But these people who grew up on hate, they hate Jews, they are anti-Semites, they take it out on the state of Israel, which is the nation state of the Jewish people. There are no two ways about it. These are the hard facts of the issue. Anti-Semitism has been called the measles of humanity. I'm afraid that is not really an appropriate term because measles has pretty much been cured in most places in the world. I'm not even sure it exists anymore, maybe some places in Africa. But anti-Semitism, as opposed to measles, keeps changing its form, coming back in different forms. It's basically hatred of Jews, and it just keeps coming back. And now it even exists in the American Congress very openly. which is extremely unfortunate. The fact that such a thing is happening now. But I know I don't like to keep repeating about anti-Semitism, but I think we have to keep reminding ourselves. And not only is it still here, but it seems to be growing, and maybe I'll say a few more words about later. I'll be back after the break.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. The first segment of this program, I spoke about the rise of anti-Semitism. And then I saw an article in the paper. I generally don't read directly from articles in the paper, but I want to share it with the listeners because this is really, I think, shocking. There was a brazen and horrifying attack last Thursday, a week ago. A fellow named Rabbi Shlomo Nojinsky, a Chabad emissary serving in Boston. This stands out among the rising number of anti-Semitic incidents that are plaguing the United States. Nojinsky was sitting on the steps outside the Shiloh House, which was in use as a summer camp in Boston, when 24-year-old Khalid Awad allegedly approached him with a gun in hand and demanded that Nojinsky take him to his car. Nojinsky began to run, but not before Awad stabbed him 8 times. Now, this is in Boston during the day. Now, lucky he survived the attack and is listed in stable condition and in good spirits. His brother, interviewed last Sunday, said it was clear that his brother would have been abducted and killed if he had entered the car. The reaction to the attack, which the Anti-Defamation League said sent a shockwave of fear and anxiety throughout the community, was swift. Hundreds of people attended a unity rally in Boston last Friday morning. The Boston District Attorney, no less, said we have to recognize that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and we need to hold people accountable for when they do this so that they're made an example of. I don't think as a member of the Jewish community who did not hear about this stabbing and think to themselves, it happened here in Boston. Now, the Diaspora Affairs Minister of the Israeli government, Nachman Shai, who had just returned at the week's end from a solidarity trip to Miami to support the Jewish community there in the wake of the Surfside condominium collapse, continued the trend of Israel comforting the plight of diaspora Jews. He called Nojinsky and assured him that Israel is committed to fighting anti-Semitism around the world. When a Chabad emissary is stabbed outside a Chabad building in a major American city, you don't have to investigate too hard to identify it is a clear case of Jew hatred. Last week, the Jewish People Policy Institute called on the new Israeli government to establish a task force to combat anti-Semitism. In its annual assessment of the Jewish world, the Defense Minister Benny Gantz here in Israel last Sunday, they noted dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in the United States particularly. The rise in anti-Semitism has been increasingly driven by entities on the left, which hope to delegitimize Israel and its right to self-defense. When we add to this a surge in anti-Semitism on the right, the outcome is that over half of U.S. Jews now feel less secure than they did 5 years ago. It's been recommended that Israel take decisive action to protect Jews in the diaspora from this ugly wave of anti-Semitism. Someone has proposed a task force which monitor the extent of the phenomenon, anti-Semitism, develop tools for combating it, set overall policy, and launch initiatives vis-a-vis foreign governments, Jewish communities, and other relevant entities. This is very interesting. The State of Israel was set up for many, many reasons. There are people who were Zionists who felt it'll bring about the coming of the Messiah. There's all kind of religious reasons for setting up the State of Israel. There were people who felt had nothing with religion. They simply felt there has to be a safe place where Jews can go, no questions asked. That has nothing to do with the visions of the Messiah or anything else. It has to do with a safe place for Jews. Now, the Jewish state is being asked to help Jews all around the world to go to those communities. In other words, not for Israel to act simply as a safe place where Jews can go when they're in trouble, but rather the state of Israel must provide aid to diaspora communities, Jewish communities, in order to fight anti-Semitism. So it's clearly we need something like that. Secure Community Network, the United States organizations that advises Jewish communities on security matters, said that it recorded an 80% spike in anti-Semitic acts in May amid Israel's 11-day war with Hamas. In other words, people are using Israel's wars as an excuse to attack Jews, particularly in the United States. Among the acts of anti-Semitism that were listed by the Secure Community Network were acts of vandalism from Oregon to Virginia, synagogue desecration from Illinois to Arizona, reports of people having bottles thrown at them, children's playgrounds being doused with swastikas in New York and Tennessee. On May 21st, 5 leading Jewish organizations published a letter to U.S. President Joe Biden suggesting that his administration take 6 specific steps to control the rising and to combat the rising attacks on Jews. Now, here are the 6 steps. First of all, they have to be publicly condemned by the administration. You have to appoint a special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the State Department. Think about it now. They're asking the American State Department today, in the year 2021, to set up a special envoy to monitor anti-Semitism. They said they should reestablish the position of White House Jewish liaison, convene a meeting with White House officials and Jewish leaders to discuss anti-Semitism. Of course, in my mind, discussing anti-Semitism is something you do when you can't think of anything else to do. You talk about it. So I can't see the point in that. And they should preserve former President Donald Trump's 2019 executive order classifying anti-Semitic discrimination as a violation of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the U.S. government, should provide funding to enhance security at religious institutions. So, what do we have? We have anti-Semitic acts and attacks and incidents once again becoming common on the American landscape. So it's more vital than ever for both the United States and Israeli governments to take more active roles in stemming the tide. So that is what is being recommended. Of course, there are many people, including people like myself, who would say the anti-Semitism is a disease that has no cure. It's a good idea to suggest that the American government fight anti-Semitism. But my own feeling about this is it would be a very good idea if a lot of Jews would consider Aliyah. We can't change the way things are in the world. I have been living in Israel more than 50 years. I did not come here out of a fear of anti-Semitism. When I was young, when I came on an Aliyah, there was anti-Semitism like there always is, but it wasn't the way it is today. I always felt people should come for positive reasons to help to build the country. But there's no doubt that in present situation, and the fact that there are anti-Semites in the House of Representatives who are very vocal about their anti-Semitism, might mean that it's a good time for American Jews to think about coming to the Jewish country. It's much easier to make a living here now than it was when I came, and it's a beautiful country, and we have to fight anti-Semitism, that's for sure. But for the individual Jew, Aliyah, coming to Israel, may be the best solution. I'll be back after the break.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello, I am Walter Bingham. If you want to hear the news behind the news and the true perspective on world affairs, then the Walter Bingham File is the program for you. We bring you interviews with the movers and shakers, political commentaries, and on-the-spot reports of events as they happen. All here every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Israel time, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And it's all archived on our website. Make it a date.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. In this last segment of the program, I want to do what I call under the radar. These are short items that shed light on what's happening in Israel and in the Jewish world. They're not related to each other. Now, the first item is one that appeared on the inner pages of several newspapers here in Israel, both in Hebrew and in English. It said a young lady named Yasmin Jabbar, a resident of Jerusalem's Old City, was sentenced by the Jerusalem District Court to 30 months in prison as part of a plea bargain, and she was convicted for spying for Hezbollah and for Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force. Now, her relatively light sentence stemmed from the fact that she cut a deal. She was caught before she had succeeded in causing significant security damage to Israel. She was arrested in August 2020, so she can be released as early as February 2023 for good behavior. The Shin Bet, the Israeli security agency, the Israel police, and other branches of the security apparatus announced in September 20 how they had uncovered the recruitment of Jabbar. Hezbollah, it's a terrorist organization, organizes conventions for young Palestinians in Lebanon, Turkey, and other countries as a way of cultivating recruits from Israel and the West Bank. Hezbollah seeks to form cells to help with intelligence collection and terrorist attacks. She was identified by Hezbollah operatives when she attended a conference. She was also given a code name to disguise her identity. During travels to Lebanon, the operatives from the joint Hezbollah and the Quds Force introduced Jabbar to senior operatives and who were known to have been involved in recruitment in Israel for terrorist activities. And the connection between Jabbar and the agent there even became romantic. Now, the point I wanted to make, here they caught a young lady who was spying, a young lady who lives in Israel. At the very beginning of the articles, it said who the young lady was. She lived in the old city, that old city of Jerusalem. But here it is. Until her arrest in August of 2020, she had been employed by the National Library at the Hebrew University of Museum. In other words, I often go to the library of the Hebrew University. There are a lot of Arabs there. A lot of them are part of the workforce. And here we have a nice young lady, I use the word nice in quotations, working in a Jewish institution, making, I would assume, a decent salary, rubbing shoulders with Israelis every day, getting a salary from an Israeli university, and still allowed herself to be recruited to be a spy. That is something that should appear on the front pages of the newspaper and not on the rear pages. By the way, one of the things which it indicates is how hard and how successful, hopefully, our secret service organizations are, like the Shin Bet, the Israel Security Agency, that they found this young woman before she could do any damage. But the bottom line is, here's a person making a nice salary, earning a living at Hebrew University, who became involved in spy activities against the state of Israel. That should be on the headlines, not tucked away in the back pages. This next item has to do with the number of people, not in absolute numbers, but in percentages, who are drafted into the Army. There is a decline in men and women recruited to the Israeli Army across all sectors. Over the last year, 67% of eligible men and 55% of eligible women were drafted into the Israeli Army, with 35% of women who received an exemption getting it on the basis of religion. In absolute numbers, 18,900 women requested an exemption from the Israeli Army for religious reasons, and all but 219 were approved. Now, it's very interesting. Within the religious Zionist community, a very large percentage of women who do not serve in the army perform a year or two of national service in areas such as education, assisting the poor, or aiding the elderly. My two daughters both did national service. On the other hand, I have granddaughters who serve in the Army. Right now, I have 4 granddaughters in the Army, one of whom is a professional soldier. She's a major in the Army. There's been an increase in recent years in general of religious Zionist women who serve in the Army, despite a backlash from certain portions of the more right-wing religious Zionist community. However, in the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox sector, far fewer women perform national service. The vast majority of religious Zionist men serve in the Army, and they make up a larger percentage of combat soldiers and officers than the relative percent of religious Zionists in the country. I have several grandsons who are in the Army. One of them is a professional. He's a professional soldier. He's now a major. Actually, it's an interesting situation. I have both a granddaughter and a grandson, cousins, that is. They're children of two different, two of my daughters. They're both professional soldiers. Until today, a very low percentage of ultra-Orthodox men serve in the Israeli army, and this is a very hotly debated issue. Perhaps I'll spend more time when I have more details when I can speak about it. And I want to say something about a Jewish neighborhood which is right off the main highway leading north from the old city toward the Hebrew University, and it's become a bit of a controversy. There are Jews living there under guard. This area is called Sheikh Jarrah, but it was originally known as the Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood before the war in 1948. That neighborhood was named after Simon the Just, an ancient Jewish high priest whose tomb has been traditionally believed by Jews to be located right there. Before 1948, Sheikh Jarrah was a quarter adjacent to but separate from the Shimon HaTzadik quarter, and Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, was referred to by that name both by the Jews and the Arabs in their own pronunciation as well. Now today, when people hear the word Sheikh Jarrah, they think the area is an Arab neighborhood. Even if they heard the media say the Jews owned the real estate, they may wonder why and by what right Jews own real estate in an Arab neighborhood. On the other hand, if people hear or read the name Shimon HaTzadik or Simon the Just, then they might think it is quite natural for Jews to live there. So therefore, a little bit of history is known here. That area, just northwest of Jerusalem, northeast, was a Jewish neighborhood starting in 1876. And the Jews built homes there. And during the period of British rule in Jerusalem, from 1917 to 1948, the Jews who lived there were harassed quite a bit by the Arabs. However, the Jews who lived here in 1947, when the UN General Assembly made the partition plan, and right after the partition plan, Jews traveling on the roads were attacked in several places, and shots were fired at Jewish homes. So the attacking Jewish traffic on those roads was the strategic a tactic of the Arabs. But now, after 1967, Jews went back to that property, which was theirs. They had owned it. So today there's a big struggle. The Jews are living there. They're protected by the Israeli army and by the Israeli police. So we have a situation right here in Jerusalem. We have like something like the situation in Berlin after the Second World War. The Jews are living here in Jewish property in a generally Jewish neighborhood. They're being protected by the Jewish police and the Jewish army. There's a lot of Arabs living around there, so it's kind of unsafe. So it takes a lot of guts to live there, but it is a Jewish neighborhood. It's named after Simon the Just, and simply calling it by its Arab name does not do justice to the Jewish cause. Having said all that, I just want to touch upon this. Anybody's visiting in Jerusalem, you take a 5-minute ride, a bus ride, northwest of the old city, and you find yourself in a Jewish neighborhood. It goes back to before 1948. Having said all that, I wish everybody a pleasant week. Take care of yourselves. Until next time, Jay Shapiro signing off.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom!
Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Malaya Dumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Malaya Dumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.